All right, so it is our pleasure again to bring you back to the stage. And this afternoon, we have put together a fantastic panel for you. And this panel is going to go in a lot of different directions, but in particular, I'm going to hand it over to Keith Berns once again. And our panel this afternoon is the rebirth of circular economy and what is the global perspective. So as you find your seats, I'm happy to turn it back over to Keith Berns. Take it away.
All right, thank you, Jessica. So as I was thinking about this panel and thinking about, how I wanted to approach this, the first thing I thought was, what the heck is a circular economy? I figured if I was going to be part of this panel, I should probably at least know that. So before I introduce my panel members here, I wanted to just share just a little bit maybe that would set the stage as to what we're going to be talking about. And then who knows, this conversation could go any number of directions from there. But basically, I do want to just, kind of set the stage here briefly. So a circular economy, basically, as opposed to a linear economy, where you take something, you make it, and then you just throw away the waste, which, let's be honest, that's the way a lot of us live. A circular economy, we're reusing, we're recycling, we're taking the waste stream of one process and turning it into part of the manufacturing process of the next process. And so really, if you think about it, that's what we're doing when we compost. That's what PrairieFoods is doing when they're taking that manure and the distiller's grains and they're turning it into a product we can put back into the soil. So don't let the term circular economy scare you away. It's nothing super fancy. It's just simply, hey, let's try not to waste stuff. Let's reuse it. Let's get it back into the system of how we're doing things. And really, when it comes to agriculture, guys, we're living this out all the time because within our farming systems, we have a lot of circular economies. We have these different agricultural cycles. And we'll be touching on a lot of these cycles up here today. We'll be talking about how carbon cycles, nitrogen, the minerals, the water, energy, finance, these things all cycle through the system. And to be honest, the producer who is going to be the most successful, or the consumer for that matter, is going to be the one who figures out how to plug the leaks in these cycles. We have a leaky cycle when we're exporting our carbon and our nitrogen and we're not replacing it through the free stuff that's out there for us to get. And we have to spend a lot of money to replace it. We have a leaky cycle when we get a 3-inch rainfall, but only an inch of it goes into the ground. Well, we can't say we got 3 inches. And so we need to figure out how to plug the leaks in these cycles. And so that makes it then more circular. Now, I can give you the circular economy, the Bladen, Nebraska perspective, which may or may not be very helpful to you. So we brought in some world-renowned experts to give us the global perspective on not only how this plays out in Bladen, Nebraska, or Pratt, Kansas, or wherever you happen to be from, but what they see happening at the global level, and then we really want to try to bring it back to how does that affect the local farmers here. And it's important because we are really all tied together. And even though we may not travel very far outside of the little areas that we live in, what is happening in other countries, what is happening in other economies, it will affect us. It will affect us one way or another. And so these men are going to be able to lend really good perspective onto what is going on in other parts of the world and other sectors and segments of our economies that we're not nearly as familiar with. And then they're going to help us see how we can apply that back to our own local level. So I'm just going to do some quick introductions here, and then each of these men will give a bit more background on themselves if they'd like to, and then each has some kind of opening statements, some opening thoughts. I've got a few questions, and then I think the way that we want to handle it in order to best utilize the panel time is if you have questions, I'm going to be putting my cell phone number, my computer number up here. I want you to text me your questions, and that way I can kind of sort through them and organize them, and then I can get those questions asked to the panelists. So we're not going to be coming around with a microphone. Just grab your phone, text it, If you don't like to text, which I know people sometimes don't, that's fine. Write it on a card, give it to Jessica or give it to any of the Prairie Foods people. They can bring it right up here to me as well. And that's how we'll get the questions to the panel members. So to my immediate right here, we have Michael Doane. Michael is the global director for the Nature Conservancy on food and water programs. And I've known Michael for quite a few years now. He actually, his family farm is not very far from us. He's at the Downs, Kansas area there, so I get to drive past his place on my way down to Pratt all the time. But Michael will bring perspective from a nature conservancy organization that's doing work in all manner of countries. We just had a meeting with your lead from Argentina. We met with him on is that just Friday? Yeah. I think that's just Friday. And it's really interesting to see the work being done in these other places, in these other areas. Michael's going to talk a lot about water and how important that is to these economies, because we all know what happens when we don't have enough water. And we're living that out right now. So Michael will be bringing global perspective on that. Next we have Dr. Tom Hoenig. And Tom is... he's got quite a resume. If you scan that deal and bring it up, you can look. He's been deeply involved in the financial sector. Grew up in Iowa, so he's an Iowan by birth. Is in Kansas City now, I believe I heard him say. Has worked extensively with the Federal Reserve banking system, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Has lots of leadership experience there. And Tom is going to be able to bring some perspective to us on finance and how all that's working. Now, I know if I ask a question about inflation, that may just take the rest of the panel time. So I'll have to be kind of careful about what kind of questions we ask there. I know that Tom's got a lot of thoughts and experience and a great perspective on inflation, and he's known as an inflation hawk, but unfortunately not everybody listens to him. So here we are. Next we have Mr. Damien Speight, and Damien is Vice President and Head of Green Carbon and Renewable Fuels, and Damien is going to be able to bring some really good perspective on global carbon. And Damien, you're based out of London, is that correct? Yeah. And so Damien will be able to not only talk about how carbon sequestration, carbon programs might work for a Kansas farmer, but how he sees that working worldwide, because carbon issues are not local to Kansas and Nebraska. It's a worldwide deal. Sometimes we forget about that. So Damien is going to be able to really hone in on a little bit of that global perspective, not only on carbon, but renewable fuels as well. He has a lot of experience in that industry as well. And then down at the end, our last panelist that will introduce himself, Frank O'Keefe. Frank comes to us from New York, spent the early part of his career on Wall Street, working in different sectors of the finance and commodities type industry. And now he's still from New York, just not New York City, and is now involved in some regenerative agriculture programs, again around carbon, around energy, and really looking at carbon neutral, low cost, closed loop systems. And so very excited to hear what he talks about. And Frank, you're working specifically with some beef operations too, is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, so he'll be able to talk about the beef industry in particular. So I think it's going to be a great panel. I don't know exactly what all we're going to ask these guys, but send your questions over to me. I will put that, let's see, there's that number. We will have some other slides coming up here, so if you want to write that number down, it will come back up again, 402-204-8946. That'll come right to my computer here, and we'll be able to get that question asked to the group here. So, Michael, you're first. I don't think you have slides, do you? You just have notes here?
No, I don't.
Okay, so go ahead and give us your thoughts.
Okay, thank you, Keith, and thanks for the great talk earlier today. I think I've seen that several times, but I learned something new each time. And really, I'm probably just going to accent a few of the things that you actually brought up if I'm lucky here. First, I would just say a word about the Nature Conservancy. Some of you may know who the organization is, but if you don't, it's a long-standing environmental NGO, and I know for some people that's about all you need to know, and you'll just turn your ears off. I would invite you to listen to the rest of this talk, if you would, for 5 to 7 minutes. The Nature Conservancy was started 70 years ago, and it was started by a group of citizen scientists who at that time had become convinced in upstate New York that there was a rare plant that was only growing on one piece of a property, and the only way to really preserve that plant in their idea was to actually buy the property and manage it for the conservation of that plant. And so that spawned, at that time, the modern land trust movement. That's now branched out over the last 70 years to many organizations, so it's not just the Nature Conservancy, but many groups now do that. And so we still do protection work classically, where we actually will acquire or put conservation easements out or lobby for policy to do that in different ways in different parts of the world. And it's really a protection mission. It's the idea of protecting nature for various reasons. But over the last 10 years or so, we've really started 2 flagships in addition to that. One is really thinking deeply about climate change and how significant that could be for the health of the planet and people as a result, so working both on mitigation and adaptation work. And then food and freshwater systems, and that's the work that I'm privileged to lead. Now, I came from the agriculture sector, so I'd spent the first half of my career both farming and also working in agribusiness, and I was also on a journey. And that journey led me to believe that agriculture, done right, could actually be a big part of the restoration economy. And so right now, people are talking in Egypt, they'll be talking in Montreal in a few weeks about how do we actually invest forward to solve climate change, to solve the biodiversity crisis. And our perspective on it is that agriculture is a big part of the solution. And so I'm here to talk a little bit about water in particular, but I think as we talk about a circular economy in Kansas, those of us that are growing up in the state or trying to be productive here know that you can't have any conversation about a circular economy without solving the water issue. And so when we think about fresh water, fresh water is really about watersheds, and watersheds are really about landscapes and landscape management. You can't really get them too far apart. There's 12 big watersheds in Kansas. 88% of the land in Kansas is in agriculture, either crop or grazing. So when we think then about landscape function for watersheds, they're so intimately linked. And so that's why I'm excited to be at a conference like this, even though we're going to talk about fresh water for a moment. How can we improve landscape function? Well, it starts in agriculture in Kansas. It starts that way in many parts of the world, in fact, in China, in India, Brazil, many places, bread baskets where food is really being produced in the volumes necessary to sustain a growing planet. It's about keeping agriculture healthy in these landscape functions. Now, we have the lesson of the Dust Bowl here, and we don't need to go over that. I think it's all in our family history. We know we're now largely farming degraded assets. We're coping with that, even if we didn't realize that that's the reality. But that's also the reality around the world. In fact, FAO says that about half of the land that we're farming today is either moderately or significantly degraded. And that's not only erosion. So the structural, physical erosion is one thing, and we know how that happens. There's also chemical degradation. So in a place like China, where we do a lot of work, there's up to 20% of the soils right now that are suffering from heavy metal pollution. So cadmium or arsenic or other things that have come out of mining. Those are heavily irrigated lands, and so they've now polluted large areas of their soils. Saline is another pollutant that's a chemical pollutant. It was talked about a little bit today. So some of these are natural and man-made, but nevertheless, that's an important form. But the most important one, I think, is the one we're talking about right now. It's the one we haven't realized, which is the biological degradation of soils. And that's really then where I think the conversation about landscapes and water really kind of comes together. Now, the other thing about water that I would say in Kansas in this context is you can divide this conversation on the prime meridian, the 100th meridian. The 100th meridian, which basically runs right through the western part of the state, or at least we thought it did. Now there's been some research suggesting it's actually moved to about the 98th parallel. A very provocative idea, I would say. And I'm not going to sit here and try to convince you of that. You can just make your own observations. But I think that's the question, is are we undergoing some climatic changes here that are starting to shift weather patterns? We know that the western part of the state is dry. We know on the eastern part, we tend to have a different set of issues. But as Keith mentioned before, I think the real issue for us as farmers is that our rainfall events are more sporadic and they can be heavier. And so then the question is, how do we actually have more effective rainfall? That rainfall that actually we catch and we put it into the soil and we can actually recruit that for the services of the plant, but I would also say for the hydrology of the watershed. So important that we do that, that we slow down and intercept that fresh water and put it through the soil as a filtration. And also make sure that we're boosting the productive part of the agriculture there. That's where soil organic matter makes a huge contribution. Now, the other part of this story is water quality. And this is a story we don't like to talk about. Am I right? This is a tough story in Kansas. This is tough news. We are, I think, in the top 5 in states in the U.S. with impaired water bodies, okay? Not a list that we want to be on, but this is for aquatics, for drinking, for recreation. In 2012, 72% of all our streams, rivers, and lakes were impaired for one of those 3 beneficial uses. A lot of effort's been put in, some good efforts, working with TMDLs, very scientific plans to reduce loadings, to improve those water bodies. The most recent report, we're now 84% impaired, 84%. And we know some of the stories. Milford Lake provides a third of the drinking water to the state. Every year, it goes through some of the most toxic green-blue algal blooms in the world. And the lake is shut down for a period of time. It's a recreation lake. It's the lower Republican Basin, an area of agriculture that's very productive, a lot of agriculture in the floodplains. How do we improve that water quality? How do we make a win-win here? Pretty Prairie, a town not too far from here, we know that nitrates getting into shallow aquifers is a big issue. Pretty Prairie had to go through a situation where bottled water was distributed for over a decade, while the city was trying to come up with the financing to put a reverse osmosis system in so they could clean and purify the water for their 600 residents at $2 million cost. Okay, these incidences are the things when we talk about water quality in agriculture that are flashpoints. They're not easy to talk about. So we're really interested in soil health because we think it's a win-win, not because we want to go lobby for high compliance programs. In fact, we actually as an organization have a voluntary approach. We like voluntary programs that work. So I will stop by just saying that, you know, out in the lobby, I've got a publication that shows what the economics of this looks like. So the economics of these issues, lack of water and water quality, and the reduced productivity from soils degrading, despite the fact that agriculture here is over $200 billion in revenue, it's one of the sectors that has a positive trade balance. We can all be proud of that. The externalities annually are $85 billion. Okay, so when we look at the cost of 3 areas here, so the excess greenhouse gas emissions, water quality, and the productivity losses from drought and from erosion, $85 billion a year. So we're passing that on to generations. We have now an opportunity by looking at these soils to regenerate them, to solve that. Our analysis shows that we can do that at a modest profit at the farm gate. It's one of the biggest win-wins that I know of. It's got high technical feasibility in terms of its value for creation to both the public and to the farm gate. So that's why I'm excited to be here. I'll pass it on to the next speaker. Thanks.
Hey, thank you, Michael. Tom, take us away.
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me here. I want to thank Rob Harrington as well, who has done a lot of work on soil regeneration. And it's a pleasure for me to talk. I'm going to talk more about the finance part of it. And I will tell you that, you know, I'm going to start from a little different perspective, and that is, you know, energy sustains the global economy, and it certainly sustains the U.S. economy. And much of what we've just talked about in terms of pollution are because we are using and need energy and the sources of energy which pollute. And that sustains our very nice standard of living in the United States and in much of the world. And so from that, we've heard a lot of concern raised now, legitimate concern, about global warming, about pollutants, and we're beginning to take that, we, the U.S., are beginning to take that more seriously. But the fact of the matter is, and here's where it's become more difficult, 85% of our energy source comes from petrochemicals, from fossil fuels. And if you're going to get that down low enough to end global warming and end certain kinds of pollutants, the standard of living for the United States and elsewhere will have to drop dramatically. And that's really what people are beginning to realize, and I mean policymakers as well, are beginning to realize that we can't just produce enough electric vehicles. It won't do it, or windmills, or even solar panels. It's going to take more. And that's where the earth comes in. And what we're talking about here today, regenerative, circular agriculture, restoring the soil, and that is really, I think, the greatest hope for the globe going forward. And that's what people are at least beginning to see. Now, we have the Paris Accord, we have what's going on in Egypt now. They're making what I'll call small steps in that direction. I still think that if we just stop consuming, we'll be better off, perhaps. But I don't know anyone who really wants to drop their standard of living in half. So what's going on? We are talking about, I think you saw the diagram, we're talking about reuse, recycle, as opposed to make and waste. And that's really a big emphasis. And things like we're going to be talking about tomorrow, as well as what you talked about today, are part of that. And one of the parts of that is, number one, the innovator, the inventor, the innovator, the producer, you in this room will have to do it, and then the consumer has to be made to accept that, to enjoy that change as much as anything. So that's where that's where capitalism comes in, and I mean that in the following sense: you make more and better with less, and you can incent people to do that, and that's the next part of this is capital formation, which is really an issue. And I will tell you, capital, money, has been a controversial issue between different sectors of the United States, not just industries, but locations, since the founding of this country. East Coast taking the money out is claimed, West Central needing more money, agriculture needs more money. You need capital to buy land, you need capital for the equipment, but you also need capital for the new innovative ways that we're going to change consumption and stop global warming. And so if you can, and you take PrairieFood as just an example, but others, and you can use that kind of innovation, you need the capital to scale it up. And that's really part of what's going on today. How do we bring capital back into this country? We've shipped capital overseas. We've shipped a lot of capital to China. They've given us goods that they've made and we've wasted. And so how do you change that? And you do it by drawing capital in for these new productive processes, such as PrairieFood or cover crops, new techniques, education towards those techniques. That takes capital. The second thing is we need the producer to understand this. I mean, the producer has to make it work. They're the ones who have to change how they farm, how they convert energy into food more effectively, how you restore the land. The producer does that. And that's where I think it behooves the producer to do that. And the producer has to work with those who bring the capital in, whether it's the local bank, a large regional bank, or what. They have to educate those individuals because they're learning this just as you are. But we have to do it, we can do it, and here's the thing, As you add capital to this, you become more profitable. As you enrich the soil and you take carbon out of the air and put it back into the soil in better, more inventive techniques, you make more money. And profit's always driven the economy. It's not a bad thing. If it's used correctly, it really improves the outcome. So that's where you come in. You have to educate who? You have to educate the banker for operating loans. And they have to help educate the examiner who's looking over their shoulder, right? So that's part of this. That's part of the circular. That is the re-education, the use of capital well, the redirection of capital into better productive methods that we're talking about here today. And the banker can do that and educate the examiner. And you change your growing techniques, your timing of putting the fertilizer on, whatever it is, letting the banker know, no, the cash flows are changing, but we're still here. What's good collateral? Because collateral is important to getting the loan. That's all that's changing, and it's going to accelerate, which brings me to the government. Now, the government, when they get involved, it becomes political. That's what you're seeing on these global accords and so forth, a lot of politics. But there's also a lot of good that come out of it in terms of where capital is directed, what it's allowed, how we educate in extension programs and so forth. That is, I think, extremely important. So we can't leave government out, but we have to work with it. It has to know its place, and altogether, that's how we recycle and build for the future. And I think we have the world now finally recognizing that we can cut consumption, we can build more electric vehicles, but we have to use the land more productively if we're really going to solve this problem. And that tide is beginning to change, and we have an opportunity to accelerate that change. So that's my 2 cents worth there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Tom. Very interesting perspective. Damien, to you.
I think I've got some slides.
Oh, yep. Here, pass that down too. Sorry.
So, it's loud, isn't it? Sorry. So I'm from London. I'm actually from Yorkshire. You might have a different accent. What I like about traveling the world, what I particularly like about coming to Kansas is the background of Kansas and the Corn Belt. I could have put a myriad of pictures up there, but I just thought I'd put David Hoenig, and that's where I live. That's called Garraby Hill. And when you look at that, you can see it's very different to Kansas, but you can also see the landscape of the land. It's farming. And I travel the world and I spend a lot of time in rooms like this. And I don't really want to talk a lot. I want to listen. Because what I believe this room is full of is game-changing change makers. And the people that understand the problem are the people that are feeding the community and feeding the world. Now, my family didn't come from Yorkshire. My family came from Ireland. But we left Ireland for one reason only. There was a famine. And when we talk about technology solutions, we arrived with technology solutions because we couldn't let the land feed the people on its own, so it needed some assistance. And so when we talk about a local agenda here, a global agenda there, but I would say global is local and local is global. The farming community in Yorkshire face exactly the same trials and tribulations that the farming community of Kansas and the rest of the Corn Belt, and to be honest, every part of the world, which is, what can we get out of that? And I get real worried when real clever tech guys say, hey, we should go to hydroponics, we don't need the soil, let's do it in a warehouse with renewable power. I think, no, if the soil's letting us down, we're letting the soil down. And the important part here is I like to show that that's, again, very close to my home, big farming community, very different tractor. As you'll see, everything's different in the UK, but ultimately, when I look at the farming community, since time began, the farming community has been feeding its local community, its wider community, but also, as we've become more interdependent, feeding the world with its product. But it's gone beyond that now, and I like what you just said about renewable energy. we're trying to develop a circular economy. We're trying to reduce our use of fossil fuels and our reliance on fossil fuels. And as you know, when you turn up to the gas station, you'll see whether it's an E5 or an E10 blend. That's ethanol, which is corn. So every one of you guys now is not just a farmer of food, but you're also an energy major, in that if you cumulatively look at your farms across the Corn Belt, just how much energy you are producing. So if I just go back to this piece of dirt, right, and that's what feeds your family, it's where your generations have come from, and it's where your children's children will hopefully be, that's what is feeding and fueling the global economy. And I can't finish with an English accent without putting a London bus. So everyone loves those London buses. Everybody, when I live in London, just around the corner from the Palace of Westminster and number 10. And this bus actually is just outside number 10. So if I was looking the other way, you'd see Downing Street behind it. I don't think you can all make out what's on that bus, but basically it's about a project which is being developed by a guru in India, of all places, where it talks about soil and soils going extinct. So when the problems that you guys face, and it's great that the two guys before me talk about it, that's not a local problem, that's a global problem, and it's on the side of a double-decker bus. But, you know, I don't like to talk, I like to do. And I believe there are a lot of aspects around soil, fuel, and carbon that you guys in this room can address next season. And that's carbon farming. Now, I know there's, if I travel the world, I like to read a room with politics, and I don't know if this room's red or blue, right? So you've seen the politics, but the interesting feature about politics is the White House in the Sharm el-Sheikh this week, in terms of talked about solutions for the carbon economy, and the White House chose the opportunity to launch their nature-based solutions. And that's really important because I've been involved in energy for over 30 years. I've been involved with coal, gas, oil, and now renewables, wind and solar. But also, when I travel the world, I'm in Iceland, and I'm visiting this project where it's basically a large vacuum cleaner that sucks air to clean the CO2 out, to put it in the ground. Now, it'll work, but it just makes people sleep better at night to think, oh, I don't have to worry about this problem because I just switch the vacuum cleaner on and it'll clear it all up. But you guys are experts in your field. You know air has not a lot of CO2 localized. It's more nitrogen-based. And Mother Nature's given us the answer of how to find those solutions. A tree is a perfect solution for drawing down CO2. Every crop that you produce is a perfect solution for drawing down carbon. The guys have gone through it, carbon economics have talked about, just try and keep that in the bank a little bit longer before it escapes. I tried to use that following yours as well. To try and pull all that together, the land is a carbon bank. And if I look at solutions for addressing CO2, the solutions, as I've said, are in this room with game changers, change makers. Policy and legislation will be addressed on nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions will be farming and forestry. And there'll be some blue economy of what you can do with kelp and so forth in the oceans. But ultimately, you will be paid. There will be economic schemes where you will be paid to do this. Again, I talked about I do tangible solutions. Carbon markets have been around for over 30 years. Those carbon markets trade today a price spread between $1 per CO2 equivalent and $900 per CO2 equivalent. If you guys were to put biochar into your soil, and I've spent a lot of time on biochar, it can address water retention. It can give you the microbial activity to do everything that the guys have talked about. It can help with the water problems in terms of leaching. It can also kind of hold water a little bit closer, so the cost of water goes further. But interestingly, more enough, just putting it in the ground means that will be there for generations, and someone will pay you for it. And I sold that carbon for a company on the open market for $130. And that ton of material that they put in the ground was worth 2.5 times that for how much was in. So putting some biochar in the ground on a carbon market will pay. Likewise, the work that PrairieFood are doing in terms of what you can do with the organic matter, that will pay. So you're farmers, but you're also carbon farmers.
Dr. Hoenig tells us that we need to be aware of where the money is going as decided by politicians and being discussed today in Egypt. And he's entirely right, because a significant portion of the $370 billion program that was ratified and is now law, called the IRA in D.C., $370 billion, a lot of that money is earmarked to carbon capture solutions that aren't, that have not worked in the past. What does work? What does work is what Keith talked about, and that is the source of all wealth on the planet, and that's sunlight. I wanted to lead with a few comments about an article I was reading in 2019 in the MIT Technology Review, and it was about a gentleman named Jerry Hatfield, who's an agronomist for the USDA, who's doing a study down in Ames, Iowa, and has been doing that for some time. And what he's trying to figure out is what we're going to look like in 2100 when the expected temperature in the median of expected outcomes is 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit hotter, about 4 degrees Celsius. And so he's growing in a chamber that in some way is supposed to mimic the conditions that will be on the ground in 2100. And his results in terms of corn are 85 to 100% drawdown in what would be expected in this year or in 2019. 85 to 100%. The plants look great, but there are no kernels on the cobs. 70% degradation in yield for wheat. And my family, we left Ireland for the same reason. And so what Hatfield had to say was this: you want to eat in the future? Well, that's what's at stake. But we're going to have to figure it out because we have no other choice. And you folks have figured it out repeatedly in history. You've fed the world. And you've fed the Russians in the 70s when I was a kid, and with the grain trade. You've done it over and over and over again. And what Hatfield had to say reminded me of a gentleman named Gene Kranz, who you've seen in the movies when he was in charge of the Apollo 13 program. He was the man who wore a vest. And the question he asked was, what have we got on the spacecraft that's good? And because, as he also said, failure is not an option. So what is good? Well, we get 1,360 watts per square meter solar constant that net of nightfall and net of cloud cover equates to about 180 watts per square meter, which is then turned into carbon, which is, as Keith described today, ends up in the soil. And we have 400 million farmers. And right now, the OECD and McKinsey and others are talking about spending close to $10 trillion for adaptation. That money needs to go into the soil. And what we need to do is step away from our arrogant instinct that we can solve this with machines and recognize how the Earth has solved it since the evolution of this place, 3.8 billion years ago when we started to photosynthesize in the first place. And so that's what's exciting. There's a lot of money that could be directed where it needs to go that could, in fact, take the edge off this thing. And what we need to understand is that one of the solutions that undoubtedly is being discussed right now, it's being discussed openly in lots of different quarters, but it is deflection of sunlight, that thing that brings wealth to all of us, deflection of it. Now, we all know what the Keeling curve looks like. We know that in the spring and summer in the northern hemisphere, all the plants in the northern hemisphere draw down everything we've emitted. And so what happens in the curve is that CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere are actually coming down for 3 months. It's a shock. It's amazing. That's what plants are doing. They're annually changing the climate. And we're talking about actually deflecting the sunlight that enables that to happen. I can't imagine a way to choose poverty over potential wealth. And that's what we're focused on right now. So Dr. Hoenig tells us to pay attention where the money's going. And Rob Harrington said the same thing today in his talk. He said, to understand the flow of cash, you have to understand the flow of carbon. And so that's what we need to pay attention to in this environment. I personally believe that hydrochar is a game changer, that PrairieFood is a game changer, and that will enable us to, in fact, choose wealth over poverty. And so I'm happy to be here. I'm humbled to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Okay, there, I'll put the number if you want to text questions, and they've been rolling in here, so thank you. Frank, I love your analogy to Gene Kranz and Apollo 13, and the really interesting thing is, what was the problem they were trying to solve?
They were trying to figure out how to get CO2
Too much CO2.
Yeah, there was too much CO2. They created a CO2 filter. That's exactly right.
So here we are again. What do we have on the spacecraft that we can use? And yeah, I love that part of the movie where they dump all that stuff out, and they have to MacGyver something together to try to make it work. And that's maybe not an inaccurate picture of what we're going to have to do. We need to look at the available resources that we have and try to piece these things together to try to make it work. So I've got a number of questions have been rolling in from folks, and this is a really interesting one here that I'm curious to hear the answer. So if the solutions are based on the soil and into the land, should we not be worried about people like Bill Gates and the Chinese buying up all of our farmland and having control of that? Is that something that we should be worried about or concerned about?
Well, I think if you have one person or two people buying all the land, you have a problem regardless of CO2. I mean, the fundamentals are, this is my philosophy, but that you get much better outcomes when you have hundreds of people producing, learning, changing, rather than two who invest in big vacuum cleaners that pull air out of the, pull air in and put it into the ground. It's totally doesn't make any sense, but one of those two people is a major backer of that. So right. You need a diversity, but you need innovators, lots of them, to come up with ideas like PrairieFood or letting the earth be the solution to this issue. And I think the earth is the solution to this issue. And I don't think one person, it's never been my experience that one person has all the answers. Never. And I've come up against a lot of really smart people, but the problem with smart is if they forget to ask and answer the question, are they very wise? And that's the challenge you have.
Yeah.
I think I address it by not looking over my shoulder or looking about the wealth that somebody else has. It's irrelevant to me. I look at my own property, I look at my family, and I look at what I can achieve with my land. It's irrelevant. People have always liked to buy land. Land is valuable. And so you look at it and go, I'm not worried about what Bill Gates does or what Chinese do. I should be worried about what I'm going to do next year or the next 5-year plan. And here's the interesting feature. Politics is divisive. You know that. You've seen that. Someone will tell you CO2 is a problem, global warming, and someone will tell you something different. what I try and do is I look at it and go, well, what is a no regret situation? So no regret would improve the fertility of your soil. If you can improve the fertility of your soil through hydrochar or biochar or whatever product it would be, that's a no regret to the planet. It's a no regret to the local community. There's lots of societal benefits that you might get in terms of water quality and runoff and so on. But if someone will pay you to do that, and it does no harm to the land, embrace it. Embrace it straight away. And it's very important that this room understands that concept, that the carbon market is a market that you guys should be familiar with. You work out the economics of what it is to produce, you know, a lean hog, a pork belly, or some bushels of a product. In that same aspect, you can look at what the cost it would be to apply biochar to your land, what the cost would be to productivity to not till, cover crop, or making a change from, you know, your ammonia fertilizer to an organic recycled, not just a crop feed, but a soil feed like prairie char. And if someone pays you to put biochar in the ground and pays you to monitor your organic matter, and you get income from that, that's great. What you should actually be doing is saying that the Kansas community should come together as a cooperative and create that market. Make sure that market goes to market very, very quickly. Make sure that market is robust. Make sure it's tangible, and make sure that you can get, you know, a good lion's share of the value from that. And so I just say, look at the land that you can do, and as you quite rightly said, get more from less.
You both mentioned, you know, the carbon markets as, you know, as a very real part of this. And I have had several questions come in regarding carbon markets. Let's just have a little bit of a discussion around where you see carbon markets at right now, where you think they need to go, and the mechanism to get that money to the farmer so that it doesn't, you know, end up just being another commodity that, you know, the farmer kind of gets what's left over in the end. So I know there's a lot of experience up here with where they're at, the carbon markets, where they're at right now, but maybe talk about where you think they need to go. You know, I've heard, you know, people talk about the value of a ton of carbon on the carbon market. You know, I've heard anywhere from $15 to, you know, $25 a ton of what's actually getting back to the farmer. Do you have any sense of where that needs to be to really get farmers to make serious inroads into doing this carbon type farming? So I don't know who wants to take a jump on the carbon market thing first, but I think that would be a topic of great interest amongst our people.
I'm a carbon trader. I've been trading for 25 years carbon, so I guess I should address that. Placing a value on carbon is a political decision in the first instance. Within Europe, we've had mandatory carbon markets for a very, very long time. I ran a coal-fired power station, the biggest in Western Europe, 4,000 megawatts. And the UK has shuttered coal. There are about 4 stations left, and they will all close by 2025. I pivoted that coal station to run 100% on biomass, and majority of it was US forestry biomass. And that was driven by carbon market. The price of carbon for coal was much higher than the price of carbon on a gas plant, and the price of carbon on something which was biogenic. It would be zero because it's considered in its carbon life cycle, it has drawn down CO2. When you combust it, it emits CO2. We all understand that. But in that circular economy, that it has drawn that down. The pricing of that market has been extremely volatile. It's the highest we've ever seen. It's about $100 a ton of CO2. That naturally feeds through to people's power prices because the energy company that is producing the power needs to recoup that carbon. So in other words, that carbon tax manifests itself into a kind of stealth tax on the end consumer. It has to be paid for. the higher the price of carbon, the better the value it is for that one individual that had that resource, but the higher the price, the harder it is for everyone to be able to pay their bills when they're having to pay their utility bills. So it would be great to see, carbon at a rate that doesn't disrupt energy bills, so much say that they double, triple, quadruple. In terms of pricing and pricing points, this week, if you're on a tech-based carbon solution, that's trading probably about $1.50. If you're a nature-based carbon solution, which would be typically a standing forest in Brazil, Paraguay, anywhere in the world where you can get that standing forest, you could do set-aside forests in the US as well. That's trading around about $6.50. It was trading at the start of the year at $16, so the markets have come down. The challenge to the value of carbon is the narrative. If you're an oil company and you buy your CO2, an NGO might say that's greenwashing because you're not actually buying carbon. You're not stopping what you're doing. You're paying for that carbon, but you maintain your business model. I mean, if you're an oil company, that's your job, right? I mean, you don't shut up shop and say we're not going to keep producing fuel that's really required for economy. But they're spending billions. So I think what you have to do is embrace the concept that carbon is an offset, part of the journey. There will be science that will make improvements. We've seen efficiencies in power stations as we've gone along. We've seen new developments for cleaner fuels. But ultimately, how does that manifest itself to the farming community? Well, I mean, you form a cooperative in this room and say, hey, we'd like a carbon market. You talk to your local representatives and you say, we want to develop this. We need a methodology. The biggest problem you have with methodology, and I'm sure people will cover it over the next couple of days, is someone sits somewhere removed from here and decides whether that really works or not. So I think local carbon markets are really important, local to the US. I do think what the White House has launched this week is groundbreaking. I do think it can manifest itself into a tangible value. And I do like what PrairieFood are doing in their project. I've got a vested interest in it because I'm helping PrairieFood market their product globally to the highest payer. So if someone in Europe says, I'll pay you $45 for your CO2 that you removed in Kansas, you guys are going to go, yes, sell it to the highest bidder. 45 is great. And so that's where the local agenda becomes a global agenda, and transparencies of market, robustness. PrairieFood as a solution provider to you would provide that route to market. And I do know their organizational structure of where the value share is. I think the thing that they proposed to me was 80% of that carbon value would go to you guys who are buying that feed and going onto the ground.
Just to add some scale and some demand information, you traded in the ETS market, which is what, $860 billion in size, and it trades on screens. And the offset market is today about what, 1.5 billion, with a huge amount of demand lined up with companies that have claimed ambition to be at net zero by 2030, 2040, 2050. And so there's a huge amount of demand for offset opportunities, and the stumbling block is measurement and accountability, and there's a lot of people in the room, one of them right here, Russ Conser, who knows a lot about measurement, and he can help you, after the discussion. But measurement so that some of the attacks on this offset market can be answered in a robust manner. Because, to date, a lot of folks call it an indulgence to buy an offset, when in fact there may be real sequestration taking place, and there may not, but we need to be able to account for it so that the market can in fact grow to what demand requires. Because then you've done something with finance. You've actually moved money into sequestration and paid somebody to sequester for you. That's progress.
Well, the only thing I would add, this has been great, the only thing I would add is, offsets are one thing, and that's kind of how we've known about these markets, which is like somebody that has a, stated liability, and they're just looking for a way to offset that. You're part of the food system, and the food system has a climate liability. It's, depending on how you do the math, around a quarter to maybe up to a third of total emissions. That still has yet to really come into the market in a significant way. And so the guidelines for what's called Scope 3 emissions, which is really when you sell your product to somebody else in the food system, they're taking on that emission load. And so they're taking on that liability, and it goes all the way to consumer. So as you get into retail and consumer use phase, many of these companies are now making commitments to be net zero by 2040, 2050. Those incentives have yet to be unpacked in this stack of value. So if I was thinking about carbon markets as a farmer, I would also be thinking about wanting to observe that value creation before you let go of your carbon sequestration market opportunity. So it's just a consideration here as we plan forward.
One of the biggest pushbacks we get from a lot of customers about regenerative ag practices, whether it's cover crops or maybe even entering into a carbon program, because some of those require you to make sure you maintain that carbon for a number of years. Well, there's a lot of acres of land that are being farmed by people that don't own that ground and don't really know if they're going to have control over it next year, 3 years, 5 years down the road. So I think if we're really going to move the needle on this, we need to not only target the producers, many good producers in this room, but we also need to be looking at targeting landowners and getting them to understand. Do any of you, have you seen, and again, maybe this is where we can pull in a global perspective, Michael, you working in many countries and as many as the rest of you, how have you seen landowners being addressed when it comes to regenerative ag, carbon programs, any of these sorts of things, and how can we reach out and educate them better to get them to be part of the solution? Because otherwise, you're not going to get a farmer to do these practices on ground they don't control or think that they're going to have use of, because it's an investment. These regenerative ag practices are an investment that will pay off down the road, but I'm not planting a cover crop if I'm not farming that ground next year.
I think, I don't know if anyone in the room watches All Creatures Great and Small. It's a new series, it hits, right? And everybody loves it. It's a vet, and it's in the Yorkshire Dales. I mean, I am blessed to live very close to where that's filmed. Yorkshire's one of the biggest counties in the UK, but we're only a tiny island, remember? So, but as one of the biggest counties, our farming community is very diverse. From energy crop to food, but also to rearing animals, dairy, and particularly sheep. So when you go to the hilly parts of Yorkshire, it's called the Yorkshire Dales. It's those beautiful rolling hills, and you've seen those dry stone walls. Well, the subsidies that have been paid to those farmers to maintain that type of farming are going to end. And the government no longer wants to see sheep farming, it wants to see carbon farming. It wants to see rewilding. Now, of course, some people go poetically, they've always been a sheep farmer all their life, that's what they want to do. So there would be that pushback. But ultimately, when we talk about regenerative practices, what people have realized that in the interdependent world, that the sheep are not really delivering that extra value that's required within the local global economy, and so the government will pay for trees to be planted and managed. And that will improve and change the income stream for the farmers. I do honestly believe that when I've seen practices and methodologies, people are getting paid to change their practice of tillage and set aside. There are methodologies that are valid, that are out there, and if you adopt that practice, you will earn a certificate, and that certificate can be sold and you will achieve income. Everyone in this room is a commodity trader. You've all managed it. You understand your inputs, your outputs. Silvio's there, we've got all the models. You know what goes into that model before they'll turn up to your farm and put that data in, because you think about it, it's innate. So I think the obvious answer for you is if you can winnow the wheat from the chaff or see the fugazi, right? And you'll understand what's real and what's not real and what application you can apply. And I look at it as, again, coming back to a no regret. If you could get localized biochar, that would cause no harm to your property, and you could forward sell that application and make a profit of $90, a ton that you apply. Profit, not just revenue, you're going to do it. And so then you will say, how do I get hold of that material and how do I sell that into the marketplace? That's the start of the engagement. If applying PrairieFood and PrairieFood soil scientists are working really, really hard at being able to demystify soil organic matter away from the vacuum cleaner, to put it in the ground. If someone comes up and helps you develop that program and you've got that methodology and someone will pay you more than what it costs you to put that nutrient in your soil, you're going to do it. So everything that I've seen within the carbon market enhances the economics for a farmer. And the key bit is being able to make those measures, to embrace it, to make sure that you take control of it and allow the farms to become part of the solution rather than relying on these like vacuum cleaners in Iceland to draw down CO2.
The only thing I can add is, to I guess agree with that is, yes, you have renter and you have landowner for the crop, and here's another commodity that's being formed. It's these carbon credits. And if you have the incentive for profit and making money, the two parties are going to get together and you're going to have a solution. Now, it's going to take time, just like finally recognizing that vacuum machines are not going to work. So we have some dead ends, but I think that we will get to that point that there's money to be made. Let's figure out a way to share it. Let's move this ahead. That's what I think will come from, whether it's in Kansas or throughout the United States or globally. People respond to new innovations that are beneficial, and especially if they're going to make money doing it. So I think there's a solution there.
Michael, I'm assuming that, a lot of the Nature Conservancy donors own land. Are you doing things to reach out to them? I mean, I know you brought some of them to our place and, we've given tours, but, is there a bigger project plan to try to educate these landowners and help them to understand the role that they play in this as well?
Yeah, we have here in the U.S. In fact, this roadmap that we rolled out a few years ago called Rethink Soil was really written actually not only just for farmers, but really to landowners to say, this is going to be coming your way. This is a conversation that will be coming either from your tenant or from the government, so start to be prepared. So we've done a lot of education now with landowners. There's growing interest. There's also growing interest, especially by the farm management associations or the farm management groups that often serve as intermediaries between families and tenants. But I think we're still at a very low level of literacy on the whole topic. And so, probably if I was going to make a push here, it would actually be we need to continue to really accelerate through the universities, through private sector, through extension, through NRCS technical resources. We are not coming close to approaching the task of bringing people up to a point of familiarity to encounter these more complex arrangements where now we've got environmental service flows as a new revenue stream, a new cost, but also a new revenue stream in what has been a pretty simple arrangement and one that's worked pretty well as farmers and their tenants have become, or excuse me, landowners and their tenants have become familiar and sometimes just do this on a handshake. We're now starting to talk about a new deal here. And so I think it is really a point of education that we need a lot more of. And to your point, Keith, previously, countries like China, India, where you have large smallholder populations, and actually the the tenure is getting even more fractured because they'll hold on to this land, and so it keeps getting partitioned even more and more. I think that's ultimately going to come through the government in their nationally determined commitments to just make it a matter of policy to invest in these things as a matter of course. And so, we're a democracy. We'd like to find ways in a more entrepreneurial way to do this from the ground up. And so I think that's the moment that we have right now.
So we talked about, obviously we need education for the producer, the farmer, and there's lots of those opportunities. We talked about the landowner. From you guys' perspective, how do you think that, Wall Street, the financial industry, and maybe even these big corporations that are making these really big net zero claims, because there's a lot of them, do you think that they really understand regenerative agriculture and what it will take to get to net zero for us to produce enough offsets for them to get there? Do they understand that?
Yes, they do. I was brought up real well, and I was only said, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. and so I will not, criticize. I will sympathize and look with it. So there's a lot of people that would criticize and say, well, those oil majors, they're buying this CO2, but they're not changing anything. They're not changing their business as usual. Yes, they are. They're spending billions of dollars. And so some of the work that I've done is venture investment. That's why I'm here today. It's why I travel from London to come here to talk to you guys, because you're worth investing in. This idea is worth it. And so the concept about it is if those offsets weren't purchased, there'd be no conversation, no dialogue to have been had today. So it's not business as usual. They are embracing that concept. And when we look at the CO2 and Earth as an ecosystem, whether that CO2 abatement is taking place here, there, or anywhere, the planet doesn't mind so long it takes place. So the concept is if the oil majors were to not change a thing, but invest in soil carbons, tangible soil carbons that zeroed out their emissions, that wouldn't be business as usual. They would have embraced innovation, and that income stream hopefully ends up in your bank accounts. That's called innovative financial progress. So I do think that for-profit business model works. I do think that innovation of offsets is very, very important. And so I do, if we can only just look at Delta Airways, they're one of the single biggest investors in the carbon market last year, voluntary carbon market last year. So it is probably the number one agenda that the board talks at its executive meetings about. Where are we with our carbon emissions and our sustainability policies? So I do think it's a power of change, and I do think momentum's there. I think the key aspect is for the wider community to how do they tangibly access it. So people in this room might go out of this room going, no, I'm not so sure what he really was talking about, but it sounds like I can make some money. So you say, how do I make that money? So the first thing you do is you talk to Rob, who's pulled this together, serial entrepreneur. You say, Rob, show me the money. All right? And Rob will then say, okay, well, if you put my product on, so you pay Rob for his product, he'll say, I'll be able to get you some money in that carbon market. Now, whether that will be $1, $5, or $55 will be determined about the narrative of that story, because the carbon market is voluntary in this marketplace. So therefore, the companies don't have to do it. They will do it if the story's worthy. And there's nothing better than investing in farmers. It's basically, grassroots America, right? It's an amazing narrative. So you just provide that vehicle and say, look, soil carbons, whether it be biochar, tilling, set aside cover crops, or some of the more advanced stuff, what PrairieFood is doing with the soil organic matter, whichever that vehicle is, get a methodology agreed within the community, get those certificates out there, but don't be divisive. Be cohesive and collective and say, We want to be, talk to the White House and say, what a great idea to develop this renewable, pathway where we look at nature-based solutions. Yeah, we like it. And we think the nature-based solution should be A, B, C, D, make it very prescriptive, tangible that you can achieve, and then just use your fuel supplier, nutrient supplier, let's say, in PrairieFood, to show you the money.
Frank, your thoughts on, how is regenerative ag viewed, by Wall Street?
Well, Keith, nobody understands it like you do, okay? We'll start with that. But the folks on Wall Street want to understand this, and they want to make something happen, and for a lot of selfish reasons, because we live here. But this is a market that is going to be massive. This isn't something that's not discussed in any of the offices on Wall Street or places that would call themselves Wall Street that are elsewhere. This is top of mind, and it is coming, and it has to be big, and it has to be real. And so everything that Damien just said is right on the mark. What Wall Street wants to have happen is for this market to mature and for it to be understandable, for contracts to be standardized, for measurement to be approved, and carbon accounting to be understood. And then it's going to be investable, and it's going to be tradable on screens, which means that folks can sit in their office and figure out price movements and make money on bets between price movements. But right now, there's this massive demand and incredible scarcity about what's out there. There just aren't that many contracts. So what Damien has to say about, create a team here and figure out how to basically participate in this market, that I think is very powerful and something that could be achieved in short order, because there are a whole variety of very important companies that want to buy offsets that are real. Crucial to it, as mentioned, is the capacity, and Heartland here clearly has capacity to measure, or I think that's what you're advertising, correct? And so the capacity to measure and to prove that you're putting carbon in the soil means that somebody will pay for it. And my answer is, I don't think that we have people on Wall Street who are anywhere near an understanding of soil that sits in this room. But there is an understanding that there are 5 carbon sinks on the planet, and that the atmosphere is full, and that's why we're warming. The oceans are full, and that's why we're acidifying. We pull the sludge and the rock and the gas out, and we burn it, and that creates the problem. And terrestrial plants do everything they can for 3 months a year in the northern hemisphere. What's left? Soil. This is our last bet. And so you have an opportunity to drive that market. And I think that's what Damien's saying you should do.
Dr. Hoenig?
I ditto on that, except I would add that part of the process that's taking place, that's fortunate in one sense, is that the broad public is beginning to understand what's happening. And it isn't, we just stop using carbon and that'll solve all the problems. We can't. So now we have to find solutions, and you have Wall Street involved. That's a capital accumulation coming back. You have inventors, innovators looking at this because there's a profit opportunity, and the producer, the profit opportunity will come to them as well. So it's been a long transition from what I'll call kind of naive thinking to, whoa, this is serious, and this is the trend we're on. Let's find some solutions, and that's where we are. And I think Wall Street will help.
Well, I apologize to the other 15 or 20 of you that have been, here's, my pocket has been buzzing with all these messages. Great interaction from the audience, lots of good questions. Jessica has graciously given us 5 more minutes. So I want each of you to just take a minute and a half or so, closing thoughts, closing words of encouragement to the folks out here of, what's maybe one thing that they can do to really help close the loop, make their economy a bit more circular, just closing thoughts and encouragements to the group. So Michael, we'll start here and we'll just work our way down.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I was going to chime in on that last question. I was really meant to focus on water in this panel, and so I want to bring that back to water. I think what companies are now really starting to understand is where they have stress in their system, and they're really working hard to understand that better and better. And so, that gets to the question of adaptation. How well do we adapt to some of these changing conditions? And that's really where the water management comes into play. And that's again, where I think if we're looking here at the Great Plains region, Kansas as a state, the economy, the future of this economy is really going to depend on how we manage water in this state. And I think the opportunity is to then look at landscapes and the high technical headroom that there is left. This is a solution that we can make happen. This is not impossible to actually start to bring these soils back to life, improve the hydrology both for water use, for water quality, and give ourselves another shot at regenerating this economy. So that's my hopeful take on why we're all here, and that's my word of encouragement.
I would add, in a way, we're at a kind of a tipping point. We as a nation, we as a globe, are beginning to realize that there's a different way of doing this, and that there's opportunity, whether it's including, carbon markets, but also better ways to produce, better ways to use photosynthesis year-round. So people are beginning to realize that, and the capital will flow. It's everyone's responsibility. Your responsibility to learn the techniques, the innovation, the technology is actually building, and it's Wall Street's responsibility to start moving this capital in the right way, and the government's also not to mess it up either, and to move it in the right way. So I'm very optimistic about solving this problem before we have a crisis.
Well, it's getting close to Thanksgiving, and it's in our house. Is it pumpkin or is it apple pie, right? And a huge pie is normally put in front of me, and I go, "Oh, that's too much." But I know if I take it in bite sizes, I will polish off that entire pie. And there's so many people around this room that know that, right? Particularly in our age. I think the concept is when we look at the global issues, they're too big to eat in one go. So just take a slither of that apple or pumpkin pie, and then look to the farm, to look to your property and say, what can I actually do? So, he mentioned these products. So if I put some biochar, where would I get that biochar from? What would it cost me to apply it? Because everything's just models at universities, right? You look at it, where would I get it from? How would I put it on? How do I commercialize that? If I was to use PrairieFood and move away from the, let's say, synthetics, and I started feeding the soil, not the crop, what will that cost aspect be to me? And of course, with anhydrous ammonia hitting record levels, right? I mean, huge levels. It's actually pays to go with that alternative product than the synthetics. But you look to your own land and say, what can you achieve through the toolbox that you've got in front of you, and how do you commercialize that? And I think for-profit is a real power of change. And I think this is an additional revenue stream. And if there's one takeaway as you leave this room, you're a farmer, but you're also a carbon farmer. So embrace it.
Griffin is going to give the numbers tomorrow on how much carbon can be put away in the soil using PrairieFood, and the numbers are kind of shockingly good, and so I'm not going to, unlike Rob, who did in fact steal your thunder earlier. I'm not going to read the numbers that Griffin gave me, or that Rob gave me, but I think Damien is still close to the sod and a poet, and he calls us to remember Thanksgiving. And I think we have to, because we want our grandkids to have Thanksgiving in 2100. And we don't have to scale systems that don't work and use a lot of energy, or that use basically all the natural gas that we create on the planet today to operate those Hoover machines. What we do need to do is use a system that has evolved over 3.8 billion years and get paid for it. And there are buyers that want to get paid, that want to pay you now. And so I think what Damien has done today and what Tom has done, and Tom said, look, let's get together and, I think you said, share it. Is that correct? And the Nature Conservancy has done it already. I mean, they're one of the biggest offset sellers on the planet. And so I think there's an immense opportunity in this room alone. And Rob's got a strategy, and he'd be happy to tell you about it. And I hope it happens. Very hopeful.
Well, Michael and Tom and Damien and Frank, thank you very much. Let's give our panelists a big hand.